Washington, D.C., 2078. The Capitol Dome Hotel glowed with holographic banners, drones circling like fireflies above a sea of generals, senators, and defense moguls. Inside, the birthday gala of Senator Quinn, my mother. At the entrance, a guard scanned the guest list. Before I could step forward, my half-brother Adrian, in full dress uniform glittering with medals, raised a hand. His smirk cut sharper than any blade. "You don't belong here, Elara. This night is for people who shape the future, not for failures clinging to the past." Laughter rippled through nearby guests. My mother's pearls gleamed as she turned, her voice colder than the marble floor beneath us. "Elara, I told you not to come. You've embarrassed this family long enough." The air pressed down like iron. Cameras flashed. Whispers spread. To them, I was still the daughter who never measured up. But what none of them knew was that I wasn't standing outside their world anymore. I was the director of the federal security systems, the one holding absolute authority over every AI defense contract in the nation. And Adrian's prized project, the trillion-dollar Aegis Skynet, was sitting on my desk, waiting for my approval. I didn't come tonight to knock on their door. I came to remind them that the keys had always been in my hand. 15 years earlier, the Quinn estate outside Boston wasn't a home, it was a fortress of ambition. Marble halls, portraits of decorated ancestors, a library lined with defense contracts and military commendations. I was 19, clutching a thin tablet filled with my designs, a prototype AI I called Quantum Nexus, software meant to protect hospitals, energy grids, and water systems from cyber attacks. It wasn't a weapon. It was a safeguard. When I presented it at the dinner table, my father barely looked up from his glass. "Pathetic," he muttered. "No daughter of mine wastes her life building toys for civilians. This family builds empires of power, not gadgets for the weak." My mother's silence was worse than his words. She just folded her napkin, as if my dream were a stain she could brush away. Adrian, already parading in his academy uniform, leaned back and laughed. "You think the world runs on kindness, Elara. It runs on contracts, armies, and fear. You'll never understand." That night, I packed a single bag and walked out. No one stopped me. No one called after me. For the next decade, I lived in shadows, underground labs in Arizona, server bunkers carved into desert rock. I ate instant rations, slept beside humming processors, and poured every ounce of myself into Quantum Nexus. The world forgot me. My family erased me. But when the global cyber war of 2070 erupted, when half of America's satellites blinked out and hospitals flatlined across 3 continents, it was Quantum Nexus that rerouted power, stabilized communications, and stopped the collapse. I didn't receive a thank you. My name never made the news, but a sealed order arrived the next day. The president himself summoned me to Washington. From exile, I was pulled into the highest levels of security. And while my family bragged about medals and photo ops, I became the invisible hand behind fleets, supply chains, and AI defense networks. They thought they'd thrown me away, but I had been building the very backbone of the world they now pretended to control. The Capitol Dome Hotel pulsed with holographic banners overhead, AI drones weaving through the chandeliers like fireflies of steel and glass. Laughter and orchestra music swirled through the grand atrium. Guests in shimmering uniforms and tailored suits glanced toward me, the outsider at the door. Adrian's smirk deepened as the guard hesitated with the scanner. My mother's pearls gleamed under the lights. To them, I was an uninvited ghost, a failure, a stain. And then, the sound of armored engines. A convoy of Sentinel-class autonomous vehicles rolled to the curb. Matte black plating, federal insignias glowing in cobalt blue. The crowd fell silent. The lead door swung open. General Marcus Harris, Supreme Commander of the Federal Defense Network, stepped out. His gaze swept the entrance and landed on me. The air shifted. He strode forward, boots echoing like thunder across marble, and his voice carried through the hall with military precision. "Director Quinn, your presence is required inside. The strategy chamber is prepared." The title Director Quinn cracked across the room like a gunshot. Adrian froze. The smirk vanished. My mother's grip on her champagne glass trembled, just enough to spill a drop onto the carpet. The guard straightened instantly, snapping into a salute so sharp it cut the air. "Ma'am," he barked. "Welcome to the Capitol Dome." Gasps rippled. Cameras turned. Every whispered insult, every mocking glance silenced in an instant. I stepped forward. Each stride across the polished floor felt like breaking chains that had been shackled on me for years. Adrian shifted, trying to block my way, but General Harris cut him down with a glance colder than steel. Inside, conversations faltered. The orchestra trailed off mid-note. Generals, senators, CEOs all turned as I entered. Admiral Niles, commander of the Atlantic Fleet, was the first to approach. He extended his hand, his voice reverent. "Director Quinn, your rerouting of the drone fleets last quarter saved the eastern seaboard. We are in your debt." Behind him came Senator Whitmore, keeper of the defense budget, his tone smooth but urgent. "We need to speak immediately. Nothing moves without your clearance." Each handshake was a quiet coronation. Each acknowledgement carved the truth deeper into the marble walls. Across the ballroom, I caught Adrian's eyes. His mouth opened as if to protest, but the room had already shifted. No one was listening to him anymore. The ballroom hummed with whispers. Senators angled closer, generals leaned in, CEOs adjusted their collars. For years, I had been the shadow no one noticed. Now the spotlight refused to leave me. Adrian pushed his way through the crowd, jaw tight, medals flashing under the lights. His voice carried more desperation than authority. "Elara, enough. Don't play this game. The Aegis Skynet project is mine. I've invested my entire career into it. You can't." I cut him off, steady and razor sharp. "That project is already on my desk, and it will pass only if it meets the standards. Nothing more, nothing less." The room stilled. Adrian's face flushed crimson. For once he had no counterattack. Then my mother appeared, pearls glinting like polished armor, her smile stretched thin. She placed a hand on my arm, not tender but performative for the crowd. "Elara, darling, this is wonderful. Of course, I always believed you had potential. You've just chosen a quieter path, that's all." I turned, meeting her eyes. The mask of Senator Quinn never faltered, but I saw the cracks, the flicker of panic beneath the perfection. "No, Mother," I said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "You didn't believe in me. You erased me. Tonight isn't about rewriting history. Tonight is about truth." Her smile froze. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, as though the ground had tilted beneath him. I stepped forward, closing the distance so only the first rows of listeners could catch my words, but loud enough for the tension to ripple outward. "For years, you told me I wasn't worthy, that I was a failure. But every fleet that flies, every city that still has power, every defense line still holding runs on the systems I built in exile. Not because you believed in me, because I refused to let your disbelief be the end of me." The silence was electric. Adrian's lips parted, but no sound came. My mother's hand slipped from my arm, her grip useless now. A senator nearby whispered, barely disguising awe, "She's the one who controls the contracts." And just like that, the entire narrative, years of mockery, years of dismissal, cracked apart. Not because I shouted, but because the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and no one in the room could deny it. The ballroom was suffocating with tension. Crystal glasses froze midair, senators leaned forward, generals exchanged looks. Everyone was waiting to see whether I would shrink back into the shadow they'd always written me into, or seize the ground beneath their feet. Adrian finally found his voice, louder, more frantic now, trying to claw back control. Aegis Skynet is my work. My team built it. I've spent years cultivating the contracts. No one, not even you, can take that from me. His words ricocheted through the hall but landed hollow. I took a step forward, letting the silence stretch until every eye was on me. Then, calmly, I spoke. Aegis Skynet is on my desk. The sentence cracked across the room like a thunderclap. Gasps. A glass shattered somewhere near the back. The orchestra, long silent, didn't dare resume. I continued, voice even, deliberate, each word a weight. It will not move without my authorization. Not through generals, not through senators, and certainly not through family connections. Adrian's breath caught, the flush of rage in his face drained into disbelief. Admiral Niles stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, but not at me. At Adrian. "You didn't mention your sister was Director Quinn," he said coldly. "You let us believe you held the clearance." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room. Suddenly, the powerful weren't circling Adrian anymore, they were circling me. My mother's smile had collapsed entirely now, her face pale beneath the lights. She opened her mouth to spin another polished lie, but I didn't give her the chance. I raised my chin, letting the words fall like steel. "For years, you told me I didn't belong at this table. Tonight, I remind you the table belongs to me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, final, the weight of an old narrative dying in real time. From the far side of the hall, a senator began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. Then another joined, and another, until the room itself shifted, not into applause of celebration, but into recognition, respect. And in that moment, Adrian and my mother were no longer the ones holding court. They were just guests in a room that had already reoriented itself around me. The applause faded, but the silence that replaced it was louder than cannon fire. Every guest now knew the truth. The Quinn failure was the one holding the entire defense future in her hands. Adrian's face tightened, sweat beating at his temple despite the cool air. He forced a smile, voice pitched higher than usual. "Well, of course, Elara and I work closely. This is a family partnership." The lie cracked instantly. Admiral Niles arched a brow, unimpressed. A ripple of quiet laughter slid through the crowd, not kind, not with him, but at him. My mother stepped in, pearls trembling ever so slightly against her collarbone. She raised her glass, her senator's smile plastered back into place. "What did I always say?" She cooed to the nearest cluster of guests. "Our Elara has been brilliant from the start. She simply prefers to work behind the scenes. We've always supported her." But the mask no longer held. The words rang hollow like porcelain cracked down the center. Guests exchanged knowing glances. The senator's perfect narrative had shattered, and everyone in the room could see the shards. I didn't need to say another word. I just stood there, calm, hands folded lightly at my side, and the weight of the room tilted fully toward me. One by one, the most powerful figures in Washington peeled away from Adrian and my mother. They came to me instead. A senator whispering about appropriations. A CEO pitching future AI contracts. A general asking for a private briefing. Adrian was left standing at the edge, his champagne glass untouched, his shoulders collapsing inch by inch. My mother's smile faltered as her circle shrank, her polished charm no longer magnetic. Finally, I stepped back. General Harris was waiting near the exit, the doors of a Sentinel convoy glowing beyond. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't need to. The shift was complete. As I passed Adrian, he leaned forward, desperate, voice low and cracking. "Don't destroy me, please. I can't lose this contract." I paused, my shadow falling across him. My answer was simple, colder than anything he'd ever thrown at me. "Then meet the standards like everyone else." No pity, no gloating, just truth. The crowd parted as I walked out, the marble floor echoing under my boots. Not a single hand tried to stop me. Outside, the night air hit sharp and clean. General Harris saluted before opening the door. "Director Quinn," he said, his voice steady. "Washington just saw who's really in command." I slid into the armored vehicle, the city lights reflecting off its windows. Behind me, Adrian and my mother were still in that ballroom, scrambling, bleeding reputation, trying to stitch together a story that no one believed anymore. But me, I didn't have to prove anything. I had already walked away owning the night. I thought the night was over. The applause, the silence, the weight of recognition, I had already walked away. But near the far end of the ballroom, away from the cameras and murmurs, I saw him, my father. Not the decorated admiral anymore, not the towering figure of command who used to cut me down with a single sentence. Just an older man in civilian clothes, shoulders a little stooped, hands gripping a glass he hadn't touched. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. For once, it wasn't defiance or disappointment in his stare. It was something heavier. I approached, slow, deliberate. The crowd around him melted back as if they knew this wasn't their moment to intrude. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Elara, I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him more than any medal he'd earned. He swallowed, then continued. "I told you once you'd waste your life on shadows, that you'd never build anything that mattered. And tonight, I watched the most powerful men in this room lean toward you as if the world depended on it." He shook his head, the weight of years etched into the lines on his face. "It does depend on you, and I was too blind, too proud to see it." For a moment, the silence stretched between us. The part of me that was still 19, still holding that tablet of designs at the dinner table, wanted to take the words, clutch them like a prize. But I wasn't 19 anymore. I stood tall, voice steady. "I never needed your apology, I needed your respect, and I've already earned it with or without your words." His jaw tightened, a flicker of a nod. For him, that was surrender, maybe even love in his own broken language. I reached into my jacket and placed a sealed envelope in his hand. "Happy birthday." He opened it, brow furrowing as he scanned the documents. His breath caught. Inside were the transfer papers to a historic naval villa he had dreamed of owning for decades, restored, rebuilt, ready. He looked at me then, really looked. The admiral was gone. The father remained. "Thank you, Director Quinn." Not daughter, not child, director, and that was enough. The gala wound down, but the aftershocks still pulsed through the marble halls of the Capitol dome. Conversations were no longer about Adrian or my mother. They were about me. Inside, they scrambled. Adrian lingered by the catering table, his voice dropping to whispers, his once perfect posture sagging under the weight of humiliation. My mother smiled too brightly at anyone who would still listen, her words a desperate patchwork of revisionist history. But no one believed her anymore. I didn't need to stay to watch them unravel. Their downfall wasn't my work, it was their own lies collapsing under the weight of truth. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean. The convoy of Sentinel-class vehicles waited, their cobalt insignias glowing faint against the city's neon skyline. General Harris stood by the door, ever steady. He didn't need to say anything, the salute he gave me was acknowledgement enough. As I slid into the armored transport, my aide glanced at me from the front seat. "Director Quinn, shall I flag the Aegis Skynet contract in the morning?" I looked out the tinted window. Beyond the hotel, the Capitol dome gleamed against the dark sky. Drones patrolled overhead. Somewhere in the distance, the Potomac shimmered silver under the moon. My voice was calm. "No, if the project meets the standards, it will move. If it doesn't, it won't. No exceptions, not even for family." The vehicle pulled away, the glow of the gala shrinking behind me until it was only a flicker against the horizon. In the silence, I felt it settle, not vengeance, not even vindication, but something steadier. A truth that no one could rewrite anymore. For years, they told me I didn't belong. Tonight proved what I had always known. The table was mine, and no one would ever pull my chair away again. And as Washington's skyline swept past, I understood something even deeper. Some victories aren't loud. They don't need fireworks or speeches. The greatest victory is walking through the gates that once shut you out and knowing you now hold the keys.